A few summers ago, my family and I took a road trip to see some sights in Utah and Arizona and Nevada. One particular day, our plans took us through the appropriately named Valley of Fire State Park in Nevada, just inside the boundary of the Mojave Desert. As we rolled along, the thermometer on the dashboard told us that it was 117 degrees outside. Quickly, we began to perceive that the air conditioner was not working properly. It was growing hotter and hotter in the car, and my mind began to race with thoughts of what to do with a van full of kids and no air conditioning in 117-degree weather. After some tense moments and some arguing about what to do, we continued on to the Airbnb we had rented for the night. We arrived safely, only to find a note from the owner that the heat had put such a strain on the power grid that the city had declared all thermostats had to be set on 80 degrees, a very refreshing 80 degrees, you might add. The next morning, we found a mechanic who could take a look at the air conditioner and found out that, in fact, it was working just fine. In that climate, an air conditioner is good for about 30 degrees, so 117 outside means you at best get a chilly 87 degrees inside the car. That was nothing compared to a few days later when it was 122, and even the water we had in our backpacks was over 100 degrees. We learned quickly that humans are not really made for the desert. It is an inhospitable and uninviting place. Why then does our gospel say that the Holy Spirit drove Jesus to the desert? That's what the text says. Jesus doesn't accidentally wind up in the desert. He doesn't get separated from his caravan. The Holy Spirit puts him there on purpose. Why would the Holy Spirit want Jesus to be in such an inhospitable place? In the desert, you have nothing. And when you have nothing and you still make it through, you realize you had something more than you thought. If you go into the desert with a water bottle and somebody says, "How did you make it?" you might say, "Oh, I had my trusty water bottle." Or if you have a backpack full of emergency food, you might be able to say, "At least I have this food to sustain me." But if you go to the desert with nothing and you make it through, you realize that you must have had more than you thought. There must be something that got you through. When you push yourself to the desert and survive, you rely on God alone to sustain you. As Jesus told the devil during Matthew's version of this temptation story, one does not live by bread alone. In Lent, we are asked to go to the desert. The Holy Spirit wants to drive us to that place where we have nothing and learn to rely on God alone. So the question for us today is, will you go, or will you resist the Holy Spirit's lead for you? Will the Lenten sacrifices that you have chosen get you there to the desert, or are they merely for show? Do they actually take you all the way to the desert? Will you merely feel inconvenience, something that you will just find a substitute for, or will you truly feel a void in your life? Something that makes you think, "I don't know how I'm going to do this for the next 40 days. When you feel like you might not make it, that is when you have reached the desert. When you think you can do something on your own, God will usually let you. But when you arrive at something you cannot do, we open ourselves to let God take over. I first learned what it meant to voluntarily seek the desert in my first year of college. In one of my first days, in fact, I was at the RA's office to ask a question, just trying to keep my head above water, and an upperclassman came up as I stood there. I assume he was just a few years older than me, but his body looked much older than me. He seemed much older, in some ways almost elderly. He did not move like most college boys. His legs were small and his feet turned in a bit. His feet were also small and slightly club-footed. He was born with a condition that had impacted his growth, and as I stood there, he asked the RA if he could get into storage to check in his mattress. On the first day of the semester, he wanted to put his mattress into storage. It turns out the mattress was too comfortable for him, and he had decided he would sleep on the wooden plank of the bunk bed that is in the dorm room. Even with his physical limitations that were already greater than most people, he was ready to give up even more. He knew where the desert was, and he was ready to go. It's possibly because of his physical limitations that he knew where the desert was so clearly, rather than in spite of them. He understood this gospel we read today in a way that I did not, and I'm still learning from him 25 years later. He became a great friend of mine and is now a priest in another diocese. There are a few groups of men in our parish and at least one group of teenagers who began a spiritual exercise on January 1st called Exodus 90. From January 1st until Easter, they have committed to daily reflection, daily holy hour, nightly examine, 8 hours of sleep, cold showers, no unnecessary smartphone or computer use, no TV or video games, no alcohol, no sweets or soda, no eating between meals, no secular music, no unnecessary purchasing, fasting and no meat on Wednesdays and Fridays, daily check-ins with someone else in the group, and a weekly group meeting. In a spiritual and physical way, they are attempting to follow the path of the Hebrews through the desert in the book of Exodus, and Jesus on the path to the desert for Lent. They are scattered among you right now and over these next few weeks. They have learned that the desert is real and it is a place worth going to. Their goal is to live out what Pope Benedict XVI famously said: "The ways of the Lord are not easy, but we are not created for an easy life, but for great things, for goodness." Or, as another of my college friends would often say, usually in a booming Southern preacher voice, Jesus did not say, "Pick up your lawn chairs and follow me." He said, "Pick up your crosses and follow me." Physical disciplines are by no means the only path to the desert. In Lent, we hear often that Catholics are called to consider lives of prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. Each of these is ultimately a giving up, and each can lead us into the desert if we are willing to follow with our whole self. Each time you pray, you are giving up time. You are giving up all the other things that you could be doing with that time, even possibly things you aren't sure you can live without. Maybe it's that TV show you know that everyone's going to be talking about the next day, or that game that you're going to miss, and you will feel left out. Fasting is the giving up of material things, often food, but also other things. Will you allow yourself to feel the loss, or will you just substitute it with something else? For example, will you give up coffee just to fill that gap with Diet Coke? Or will you give up something that makes you think, "I don't know if I can make it 40 days without that"? Almsgiving is giving financially to the poor, to the church. Again, there are countless other things that you could buy for yourself with that money. There are even things we might think that we need that we could buy with that money. Will you be the poor widow putting in her last few coins, or are you giving from your excess? The widow understands the desert, and she invites you to go there with her. The Holy Spirit did not drive Jesus from a comfortable life to a slightly less comfortable life. He drove Jesus from what had been a normal life to total emptiness in the desert, because it was time for Jesus to do battle with the devil, both in the desert and on the cross. That is a battle that is not to be taken lightly, and he needed to be prepared for that. We are in the same battle. Father Sean Wesley, our former pastor, once said, standing right here, that when we arrive at the gates of heaven, we should not look like we are stepping off of a cruise ship. We should look like soldiers returning from battle. Lent comes to remind us that we are in a battle, and it is our very lives, our eternal souls, that are on the line. In today's second reading, St. Peter reminds us of what Jesus accomplished in the Paschal mystery. He says, "Put to death in the flesh, he was brought to life in the Spirit." Lent prepares us for resurrection, for new life. But death must always come before resurrection. Your Lenten sacrifices are meant to put to death the things of you that are inside of you that you don't need, the things that get in the way of your reliance on God. We get to leave those things behind in the desert so that we may rise to new life with Jesus. The Holy Spirit drove Jesus to the desert. Today, he calls us to go with him.